actually, there's a little known fact for many people that actually live in Madrid, not very far from here, actually. Hi, Ruben, my neighbor, I think, is somewhere in the audience. I moved here about 13 years ago to join a startup. And if you've ever worked at a startup, you probably know how it feels. Like, you have too many projects going on, a lot of proof of concepts, a lot of different prospects. One day you're working with 5 people, next day 3 of them have gone to do other stuff and you don't know where they are or what they're doing. That means there's a lot of context switching, there's a lot of heavy workloads in that kind of situation, right? And you're having to juggle and change and switch context all the time. Sometimes it's not very clear, why are we doing this? What exactly is the purpose of what we're doing? Who is the customer even, right? And what's interesting about that is actually, if you think about much larger organizations, it doesn't feel very different, does it? Even if you're in a larger team, kind of the same issues come up. We don't know exactly why we're doing this, what's the purpose, we feel overloaded, we have a lot of things to take care of that we need to constantly switch between context. All these things happen actually at any scale. So it's not really a problem of having more people or less people, it's a problem of understanding there are cognitive load limits. There are limits to the capacity of individuals and teams by consequence, right? So, Team Topologies is the book that me and Matthew Skelton published about almost 5 years ago. And basically, we're both software engineers. We have software engineering background. And if you like, the book is about applying system engineering principles like high cohesion, loose coupling, making iterative changes and getting feedback and adapting quickly. All these ideas that we try to apply to our systems and our software, but now apply to teams and structures and the way we organize ourselves, right? And I would say the number one concept people related to in the book is team cognitive load. Whether you kind of understand exactly what it means or not, there's this sort of intuitive understanding there's a limit to our capacity. And I think we've all felt like this at some moment in our career. Hopefully, not every day, but now and then it feels like this, right? Our head is about to explode. There's just so much we need to know and do that we feel like we're just, paralyzed almost. And by the way, these are some really cool, there are more statues like this. They're pretty cool if you look it up. So, actually, if you want, you can try something, sort of experiment. If you post a photo of this on your LinkedIn, for example, you will probably see maybe higher engagement than you normally would with your regular posts, because everyone sort of has felt like this at some moment, and many people feel like this all the time. And that's where we get into sort of danger zone, right? So some surveys from the end of last year found that 56% of IT professionals can't relax after their working day, right? That's pretty sad, I would say. And I don't know, maybe partially the reason why you're here is to have a bit of relaxed time from your day-to-day work, maybe. Obviously, all the learning and networking and all that. But, this is kind of a sad fact. They also found that 44% of full-time employees experience burnout in our industry. And this is where it starts to get into actually physical health problems, right? It's not just about being stressed and working too much. We're actually damaging our body and our mind. So, at the same time, it's obviously impacting our productivity, our performance as a team in our organizations, right? And John Cutler said about 5 years ago, if we want high-performing teams, if we want great digital products, we need empower fully cross-functional teams, which, in 2024 is like, Yeah, okay, nothing new, John. But actually, 5 years ago it was still not that common to talk about cross-functional teams. And by the way, John is amazing. He's like a product person, but he has all these insights into systems and organizations. He's very prolific, so I really recommend following his work. But the question is then, okay, this makes sense, but how do we get to this fully cross-functional teams that build great, amazing products? So one of the types of teams that we talk about in team topologies is what we call stream-aligned teams. You can think about them as product teams, if that's more familiar to you. But if you think about it, if there's some stream of value to the customer, to our end customers, if we understand there's a stream of work that is valuable to our customers, if you have one team that can understand those customers, understand what they need, design the system or services that are going to support that, and build and deploy and then run that thing, so the build and run kind of idea from DevOps. If you have a team with this end-to-end ownership of the life cycle for a stream of value to the customer, this is going to be the fastest way, the most effective way, to build those great products and services, right? As you can imagine, and you probably know, felt, this is actually quite difficult. But this is sort of our ideal if we want to get to a fast flow, high-performing teams. So that is one of the key tenets of team topologies. Like, why do we even talk about this team topologies, how we organize teams that interact? Two things. First, to achieve a fast flow of value to the customer, and just to be sure, it doesn't mean fast flow, doesn't mean feature factory. It's not just cranking out features that we don't even know if they're going to be used, if they're helping the users. It's actually understanding what's happening with the stuff that we deliver to the customer, right? So we need the second thing, which is a rapid feedback from our running system and services, right? We need to be able to understand, is this being used? Is this actually improving whatever business metrics we have? Are we maybe changing the user behaviors in the way that we anticipated? And if not, can we quickly get that feedback into the next iteration of our products and services? We also need teams to have a very clear mission, right? If we don't know what is the purpose, who are our primary customers, if we're just, like I was saying before, just scrambling all the time, now we're doing this, now we're doing that, for something totally different or totally different customer, then maybe the mission of the team is not very clear. By the way, anyone has seen the movie Tetris? It's actually pretty good. I mean, American movie, so a lot of exaggeration stuff, but this American guy goes to Soviet Union to get the distribution rights of the game Tetris around the world and to the Game Boy console. And he has a very clear mission. He goes through all these challenges, almost, destroys his life, but in the end, he succeeds. Typical American movie story, but it's actually based on some reality, and it's a pretty good movie. So ideally, we would want our teams to have this type of clarity of mission. What are we doing? What are we trying to achieve, right? So that's something, obviously, to keep in mind at all times. But also, the cognitive load needs to be reasonable. Yes, we want challenges, and we want to learn, and we want to build new things that are interesting, that use new technologies. Obviously, that's all healthy. But we want to keep, have our heads standing, not be dragging and have so much that we cannot even think, where do we start? So this means, ideally, each service that we have must be fully owned by a team with sufficient capacity to understand it, to design, to build, to run, and evolve it, right? Those sort of stream-aligned teams that I was talking about. I want to propose that we do a sort of variation of the game Tetris. I hope everyone knows the game Tetris, otherwise I'll feel pretty old. I played a lot when I was a kid, and actually you can play at tetris.com, just on the browser directly. That's where the screenshots are coming from. You can spend hours and hours. Actually, only last year was the first time that an American teenager was able to actually finish the game. No one actually knew what was the last screen, how it looked like. So that's him like holding his head, going mad. So what I want to propose to you is that think about, so Tetris is a game where you have a canvas, you have different pieces coming in, and you have to form lines, and when you form a line, they disappear, and you can continue to play. If we think about Tetris or the canvas as the team cognitive load, right? The capacity of the team cognitive capacity to deal with the work that they have to do and deliver. And let's say the pieces are the different skills and things that they need to know and be able to work on, right? So for those kind of cross-functional teams, you're going to need a lot of different pieces. You need to understand architecture, design of your system, infrastructure, be worried about security as well, and a lot more things, right? Obviously, the actual coding, frameworks that you need to use, all that, CI/CD, etc., testing. All these things that you would need to have in the team are still just to build the solution right, assuming we know what we should build, that we're doing it in kind of the right way, with a good approach, with a sustainable development and operation approach. But then there's all this other stuff that you might need as well. If you actually want to be that kind of streamlined team that has end-to-end ownership, that understands the customers, understands what are we doing, why are we doing this, and what is the goal. So other pieces come in then into the Tetris. So if we want to actually have a better idea if we're building the right thing, we need to experiment a lot more. We need to have much more understanding of how is this impacting the business, impacting the users, etc. So you have all these other pieces coming in, right? We need to have a good user experience. We need to have some data science capability to be able to analyze what's happening. We need to understand product viability, because if we're building something that costs more than the value it provides, then it's probably not a good thing. All these pieces coming in, so you quickly get to a situation where the Tetris game is getting very difficult, managing all these pieces. So that's where you get to this situation where you feel this cognitive overload. So what do we do? Is this game over? We just give up because we can't play Tetris anymore? Well, there's actually a lot we can do. If we need to then get into more details about what exactly is team cognitive load, what are the things that are getting to this sort of overload, right? So let's go a bit deeper about what is team cognitive load. It's actually based on cognitive load theory, which was developed in the 80s, 70s, 80s, by someone called John Sweller. He's an Australian psychologist. And people who work more often with user experience tend to talk about cognitive load from the user perspective. Right? If you want to minimize cognitive load on the users of your products or your services, you want to make things simpler for them, make the jobs that they need to do easier, simplify their life. So we're trying to think, how do we make our product more intuitive, easier to understand, easier to use, etc. And that's effectively what John Sweller then defined as cognitive load. For an individual, is the total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory, right? And if you think about a team starts out as a group of individuals, should be a lot more than that, but it's a group of individuals in the beginning, so there is necessarily a limit to the cognitive capacity that the team has as a group, right? More interestingly, there are actually 3 types of cognitive load. And they're not totally independent, right? It's not like your brain is like 20% intrinsic, 30% extraneous, etc. They're related to each other. But we understand that there are 3 different, let's say, categories of cognitive load. The first one is intrinsic. So there are core skills that we need to do our job, right? maybe for many of you, those are the programming languages and frameworks that you use, React or whatever you are using, that you need to know well enough and have experience to actually be productive. When you don't have that experience or the knowledge, your intrinsic cognitive load is going to go up. Basically means we need to use our memory to think about how do I do this, how do I do that, how do I find out how to use this framework, etc. The second one, and the first one, the intrinsic, is you can see it as sort of necessary complexity, right? To be able to actually build these products and services, we need to understand this technology, we need to understand a lot of things that are core to our work. The second one is extraneous. This has to do with the environment where we work, broadly speaking, right? So if we need to think about how do we deploy our application to the live environment, how do we run the tests, which approvals do we need perhaps to get this change into production, or we need to coordinate with the testing team or for them to run some performance tests, whatever. All these things are kind of increasing our extraneous cognitive load. And I like to think of it as sort of accidental complexity. Ideally, you don't have that. You want to reduce that, right? But oftentimes, that's actually consuming a lot of our capacity as a team, is dealing with all this sort of things, accidental complexity. And the third type of cognitive load is germane. And that's when we're actually using sort of our brain power, our working memory, to focus on understanding our software, understanding our users, customers, figuring out what is a good solution to the problem that we're trying to solve. That's when we're actually focused on the domain of the business and in the customers. So if we know this, it shouldn't be a surprise that we should try to minimize intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load so we can make more space for germane cognitive load in teams, right? So this is where it gets interesting to think about, well, for intrinsic cognitive load, there are a lot of techniques. We can have, train people, we can do pair programming, mob programming, we can do mentoring, a lot of different things that can help upskill people in the core things they need to know about. For extraneous cognitive load, it's not always so obvious. One that you might say is automating things that are, manual, yes, but there's a lot more that we can do. But now we sort of have the basic tools to understand how do we sort of address these cognitive load problems, how do we tame these issues that we saw earlier that lead to unhealthy, unsustainable ways of working. First one is to make the cognitive load more explicit. Now we can talk about it in a more precise way. We can start talking to teams, understand what are the things that are actually slowing you down, what are the things that you feel are sort of extraneous that you shouldn't necessarily be doing or focusing on. And maybe they are missing some germane capacity. Maybe we don't actually understand our customers well enough. We don't understand the purpose of the business even. So we can start having these conversations. The problem is, or one of the problems or challenges is we cannot measure cognitive load directly. That would be great if I would say, what's my cognitive load today? Well, it's 120, I'm overloaded, I'm going to go home and rest. But it's not possible. So what can we do? We can, however, look at what are the drivers of team cognitive load. What are the things, the factors that are increasing our cognitive load, right? That's something we can do. In fact, in the last few years, in the last 3 years, we've partnered with Dr. Laura Weiss. She's a PhD in organizational psychology. Yes, I didn't know that existed either a few years ago. And so she did this amazing work of researching what are some of the drivers of cognitive load. So we found about 24, 25 drivers at the moment. There are surely more. And what's interesting is that we can actually group them into these clusters. And no, these are not Kubernetes clusters. There are other types of clusters. And the first one is team characteristics, right? What is the composition of the team? What is the size of the team? Are the roles inside the team well-defined or not? Is that a problem? Different drivers that can actually increase the cognitive load of the team. That's the first one. The second one is the characteristics of the work itself that we have to do, right? It might be complex work in itself, or it might be that it's because there are a lot of dependencies on other teams and approvals, and that's making the work more complex. That's the second cluster. Third one is work practices and processes. I think that's pretty obvious, right? If we have practices that actually feels like they're slowing us down, or they're introducing dependencies on other teams, whatever that might be, on compliance or on security, testing teams. If we have poor practices and processes, that's going to increase our cognitive load. We don't have good ways of getting things done. And finally, work environment and tools. Obviously, if we don't have the right tools to do our job, or we have tools that are, we can do it, but it's kind of, it's actually a bit painful to use this thing. And the actual environment itself, right? Which might be the physical environment if you're working in the office. If we have bad lighting, or we don't have, or there's too much noise, all kinds of things can actually impact us in our day-to-day work. Or maybe because now we have more options to work remotely. For some people, it might be actually increasing cognitive load to be working in the office, because that's not easy to compaginate with their personal life, right? For me, for example, with my kids, they're small and they're in school, so I work at home or near home. So if they're sick, which actually happens frequently, I can go and get them from school and go home. If you're working in an office 1 hour away, maybe that's not possible, right? All these things actually contribute to our overall cognitive load and our ability to perform better as a team. So like I said, there are about 25 drivers split across these 4 groups. But now we start having a way to think about what should we be looking at, what are the things that are impacting the team. So we can do something like an internal survey, ask some questions to try to get a sense of what are the common problems and challenges, right, across teams. We can just talk to the teams, actually, and see what's happening. This is actually a template that you can find on github.com/team topologies. There we have a number of simple templates and techniques there that we use ourselves with our customers. And this one is sort of an example of a survey that you can adapt to ask your own teams. We've also been working together with the research that I mentioned on product, which is free for teams to use, which provides this sort of systematic way to assess those 25 drivers, right, and those 4 clusters. So it's something you can try out to get a sense of where are we now and how are we evolving, how is cognitive load changing for the team. And that's the other challenge. Cognitive load changes continuously, right? Sometimes because of big factors, like we're doing a reorganization, for example. That's a big impact. There's a lot of changes, new roles, new responsibilities, etc. Other times are smaller things. We're using new tools, or we're introducing AI Copilot. Those things impact cognitive load as well, right? So it changes basically every day, every hour. But that doesn't mean we cannot, and we need still to track it, right? So we need to measure on a sort of continuous basis. And also important is to set realistic expectations on how cognitive load is going to change, right? For example, as we're talking these days a lot about AI, Copilot, all these things, yes, those will help. They should help us, become more productive eventually. But in the beginning, when we introduce those things, it's actually going to increase cognitive load of the teams. We need to learn how to use these new tools, right? And it's actually more fundamental change of now we're writing less code and we're actually more evaluating the solutions that Copilot offer us. We're thinking about the maintainability of this code in the long run, right? So it actually changes what we do. So it's setting the right expectations. In that example, we should expect in the beginning when we introduce those tools, we actually might go slower. We might go, reduce our sort of throughput for a while until we get used to this new way of working, new tooling, etc. All right, so the first way to address cognitive load that I mentioned is make it more explicit, talk about it, assess it. The second one is actually more related to the system design, the architecture, right? And this idea that we maybe should have more team-size software and move away from a lot of discussions around microservices or monolith. Actually, if we limit the size of software services and products to the cognitive load that the team can handle, this is, in my opinion, much better heuristic to how do we organize the systems that we build, right? So at the very high level, usually what's on your right side is what we end up with often for complex systems, is where we have many components. Some are owned by teams, others are sort of orphaned. No one, maybe it was developed 20 years ago and no one knows how to change it. There are some people who are experts in some parts of the code that are the only ones who know how to change it. This is pretty common, right? If we take this team-first approach to how we architect the system at a high level, you should get to something that looks much more like on your left, right? Sorry, the other way around, right? On your right, what looks like on your right, where you end up with much clear alignment of services to the teams that own it. And you see that they don't vary as much in size. They're more similar if the teams have similar sizes as well, right? So it's a much better approach, and it's almost like at the very high level, it's almost like our system design looks very similar to our organizational design and the teams we have and the structures. And this helps us also to address what is called Conway's Law, that maybe some of you have heard about. Any organization that designs a system defined broadly will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. It's kind of hard to read, but basically means there's a strong correlation or I should say mirroring effect. The way we organize is going to have an influence, a strong influence in the actual systems that we can build. So you don't want to fight against that, you want to leverage that. And so that's where this approach helps as well. But obviously, in the context of cognitive load, is the fact that we're limiting the size of these services to the capacity of the team. So we talked about making cognitive load more explicit, assess it, survey it, whichever way works to get an idea of what's impacting teams. From an architecture perspective, thinking about team size software, I'm not saying that, obviously the discussions about microservices or macro services or whatever you want to call it also are important, but maybe we need to bring in this cognitive load factor as well. And finally, we need adequate team topologies to deal with the excessive cognitive load. So topology actually means the way in different parts of a system are interrelated or arranged. We talked about the stream-aligned teams. Those teams with end-to-end ownership would be sort of our ideal way to achieve fast flow of value to customers, right? But then we also saw there's a problem of cognitive load with Tetris, of playing all these pieces together. But we expect most teams to be stream-aligned to value streams with end-to-end ownership if we want fast flow, right? That's a starting point. But we have this problem. The game is over. It's too much cognitive load. So what can we do? Actually, the other types of teams that we talk about, their main purpose is to reduce cognitive load on the stream-aligned teams. That's it. That's the fundamental idea. So an enabling team is usually a small group of experts in some domain of knowledge. Can be anything from UX, can be test automation, can be product development, architecture, what have you. And their goal is to help the Streamline teams upskill, learn enough about those domains of knowledge that they can do the work more autonomously. They can manage those pieces. So enabling teams reduce both the learning curve to acquire capabilities in the Streamline teams, and they also reduce the need for these shared experts that we see often, where yes, we have 5 UX people who need to do all the design work and UX work for 20 teams or 30 teams. That introduces a lot of dependencies, a lot of capacity problems and so on. So instead, we want them in an enabling team, they would be able to teach and mentor the Streamline teams on the ground. It's actually working with them, pairing, going through examples, helping them learn enough to be more self-sufficient. There's an interesting example from Adidas. So Adidas has a big hub in Zaragoza, here in Spain, and they invested a lot in platform engineering internally, right? And what I found interesting, there's a lot of interesting stuff. I recommend looking at their talks. But the platform teams actually have a mandate to dedicate half of their time to what they call platform advisor and community. That's basically enabling type of work, meaning we need to help teams. We might build an amazing platform, amazing services, and there's all this talk about platform engineering. But at the end of the day, if you don't make it easier and if you don't bring the Streamline or product teams into the platform, help them understand why is this useful, why should I use this thing, how can we make it simpler for me to use it, then you're not actually reaching the potential of that kind of internal platform engineering. So in the Tetris game, I see it as a bit like, okay, now we've upskilled the team, they're able to go faster, they're able to deal with these pieces faster and create the lines faster to continue playing. Another fundamental type of team is platform teams. The main difference, there are several differences, but the main difference to traditional platform teams that we've had, at least since I started working in the industry more than 20 years ago, the main difference is the focus on cognitive load, right? The first purpose of platform teams is to reduce cognitive load on the Streamline teams. So they should provide services that reduce cognitive load and accelerate Streamline teams to deliver work with substantial autonomy. Which sounds great, but we actually need to be more specific to understand how does this happen. And that's why we adopted this definition from Evan Botcher. He said, a digital platform is a foundation of self-service APIs, tools, services, knowledge and support arranged as a compelling internal product. So essentially, what it's saying is that we treat the platform as a product, meaning we understand who are our customers, our internal teams, we understand what they need to do, how can we help them. We understand there are different teams with different experience, different problems. So we focus the platform, as a product means we don't force teams to use it. We want them to adopt the platform organically. But then there's also the self-service part. Because if you have a great platform, but it's all based on tickets, and people have to wait days until your platform team actually has capacity to solve the ticket, then we're not getting to fast flow, right? We have very strong dependencies and very slow dependencies. So the self-service aspect is key as well. You can see the platform as a curated experience for its customers, the internal teams, internal customers, right? We're making it easier for them to get the value out of these services we provide, whatever that might be. Can be infrastructure, monitoring, Kubernetes, whatever we do, we're making that easier for our internal teams, not harder, hopefully. Otherwise, you increase cognitive load. A few years ago, if people are familiar with the State of DevOps report that comes out every day, it's a survey of thousands of organizations. And a few years ago, they actually looked into some of these ideas and challenges. And they found that highly evolved firms use a combination of Streamline teams and platform teams as an effective way to manage cognitive load at scale. Essentially what this means is that, yes, we can reduce some kinds of cognitive load, but there are other kinds which we cannot really eliminate, but we can push it to be more germane, right? So to give you an example, if you have a streamline team or product team that has to worry a lot about how do we do monitoring, how do we do observability, and we don't know all these tools, and it's actually causing us a lot of cognitive load, that's sort of extraneous for that team that wants to build a product. But if you have a platform team that's actually building services around monitoring observability and doing that, a bit of that enabling work to help the product teams understand why is this important, how do you use it, how does this help you go faster, detect problems faster, then we are managing cognitive load in a better way because the platform team is focused on their own germane cognitive load, which is around the monitoring and observability aspect. So in the Tetris game, this is a bit like some of the pieces don't even come into the game anymore because there's a good platform that abstracts or simplifies a lot of what we used to have to deal with, right? They're not even in the game anymore. And finally, the last type of team are complicated subsystem teams. We actually struggled a bit to include this, but there are situations where you have really complicated mathematical models, for example, things that you actually need a team dedicated. For example, in that startup that I joined here in Madrid, we had a face recognition subsystem, and we had one person with a PhD who was the one who was able to change it. Because it just requires, at that time, today you have other options to do face recognition, but at that time, you needed someone fully dedicated to work on that. And so sometimes, from a cognitive load perspective, we need to have these complicated subsystem teams. So they build and evolve part of a system which requires this specialized PhD kind of knowledge, right? But we should be very careful to minimize this as much as possible because they can become sort of a component team, and if you have many teams that depend on them, you start getting bottlenecks and problems of many dependencies to one team. In terms of our Tetris game, I feel like this is complicated subsystem. If you don't have it and you have very complicated part of your service or product, it's almost like there are 10 pieces coming in at a time instead of one at a time, right? And so it's really impossible to play the game if you don't have a team that can take care of that very complicated part. If you really need it, it's not about, in general, complicated technology, for example, it's about really complicated algorithms or something that requires that kind of knowledge. So, we talked about these 4 fundamental team types, right? And how there are streamlined teams for fast flow, and then there are 3 other types of teams that their primary purpose to reduce cognitive load on streamlined teams. But these teams don't exist in isolation. They need to interact. We need to actually figure out if this is working. It's not just in theory, but actually, is the platform actually reducing cognitive load? Are the enabling teams actually helping upskill and provide kind of core skills to the streamlined teams? And so that's why we talk about 3 team interaction modes that are very precisely defined, right? It's not kind of open-ended. We have collaboration where 2 teams work together to find a solution to some common problem or to improve the way they work together. And they do this for a period of time. You have access as a service where it's typical for platform teams, but can apply elsewhere, where one team provides a service that other teams consume. So in fact, they don't actually interact directly. They interact through using the service. And the last one, facilitating, is typical for enabling teams, but can happen between any teams that are more experienced and more junior teams, where one of them, the more experienced, helps facilitate knowledge and upskill the more junior team or less experienced team, right? Like I said, can be any kind of domain of knowledge. Even we've seen examples where legal teams are facilitating software development teams, helping them understand regulations and things that they need to worry about as they build their products. GDPR, for example, is a good example several years ago. We need these clear interactions to understand, okay, especially when there are problems. So we thought the platform was being consumed in this X as a service way. It's easy to use, understand, but actually we're often getting people asking for help. They don't understand how this works, or it's not available, has performance issues, this platform service. So something is wrong. And then we need to go back and figure out, look, this is actually not helping reduce cognitive load, it's actually increasing. Let's go back to collaborate and understand how should this platform service work so that it helps us, not hinders our work, right? So understanding why and when and how long this interaction should happen is also key to reduce cognitive load and deal with cognitive load in the long term. And so these are the 3 points. So first of all, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from today, it's just this idea that there is a limit in our cognitive capacity as teams as well. And that's often the blocking factor for us to be able to be more effective and have more sustainable development of our products and services, that we have too much on our plate, basically. And then when we understand actually how cognitive load works, what are different types of cognitive load, we can start talking about it, assessing it. We can look at our architecture as well, make sure that we have services aligned to the capacity of the teams. And finally, think about what is some useful topology for us that can help. What kind of enabling teams we might need, platform teams, perhaps complicated subsystem if you really need, so that we can, as a team of teams, deal with the cognitive load problems in an effective way and have people more engaged, less burnout, and effectively becoming more productive, more performing. That's it. I hope it was helpful. I'll be around until the afternoon, so always happy to chat, and looking forward to see the other talks as well. Thank you very much.